In this video, we're going to look at a pretty incredible technique that will allow you to avoid rendering twice. So say for example you want to add a texture or a bump map, different shadows, and even quickly add dirt and grime to the entire scene without the need to modify individual materials before you render. So let's take a look at how we can do it. I'm going to demonstrate it with this incredibly straightforward scene. And if you want to grab this scene together with the compositor node tree already built, then you can download that from the 3d-illusions.co.uk membership area. We've got a few monkeys in here, we've got a camera set up, and each of the monkeys have got the same material, which is basically this grey principal BSDF that's got the roughness turned right down. To light the scene, I've got a HDRI world environment. So if we go into the shader editor, then go into the world tab, you can see we've got a environment texture, and then it's just been controlled by a mapping node and a texture coordinate node set to generated. The first thing we need to do for this to work is enable one of the passes. So let's go into the view layer properties and just tick the UV option that we've got there. And obviously, in order for this to work in future, you're going to need to enable this pass before you render, or you can render afterwards just this UV pass, and that will be incredibly fast to render if you turn off all the lights in the scene so that there's basically nothing for the render engine to do other than generate the data pass, the UV pass. Once we've done that, we'll go to the compositor and turn the compositor on, and then just do an F12 to render. Okay, when it's finished rendering, if you're not using the Turbo Tools add-on, you won't get this node, you'll just have this one. But these basically operate identically. So this is just a replacement for this that allows you to do all the things you've got in the Turbo Tools add-on. But basically, if you don't have the Turbo Tools add-on installed, then you work with this one instead of this one. So everything will be the same, you'll just be using this one. To demonstrate the technique in its most basic form, I'm going to initially add dirt and grime to the entire scene. This initial basic method I'm going to show you does have a few limitations, but it demonstrates nicely how the technique works. So let's initially bring in a dirt texture. Any dirt texture is fine. I'm going to use this one from Ambient CG. It's a metal material, but it's got this nice looking sort of dirty texture included. So I'll just drag this one in, and that will automatically bring this texture material in for us. And if you've not used the compositor before in Blender, make sure you turn the backdrop on up here, and you can automatically add a viewer node by Control-Shift-clicking, left-clicking on any node you want. And providing you've got the Node Wrangler add-on installed, it will automatically create this viewer node for you. The Node Wrangler add-on comes included with Blender, by the way, so you just need to turn it on in the preferences. Right, so this is what we've got. We've got this texture, and I want to apply this texture somehow onto all of the objects in the scene. This is why we've turned on the UV pass. So let's just consolidate these two wires into one by Shift, right-clicking and dragging. And I'm going to use something called a UV or Map UV node. So drop that in there. We're going to plug the image texture, the dirt texture, into the image input. And we're going to connect the UV pass into the UV input. And if we look at what we get now, so Control-Shift-click on this one, you can see it's actually applied the texture to the objects based on the object's UVs, so that the texture actually follows the object's surface in 3D space. So we'll mix it in, Shift-A, S, mix, drop this onto the original image. We're going to plug this one into the bottom, and now we'll have a look at this one. And you're probably going to notice this node is quite slow, because it's doing quite a lot of calculations. So if you do have the Turbo Tools add-on, I'd recommend you cache this node here by clicking on it. Make sure your cache is set to 100% to match the render resolution, and just click cache. That will then make it real time, so we don't have to wait anymore. This will no longer recalculate, it'll use the cache instead. Alright, so we've got that mixed in, and you can see we can mix the two together. And if we turn on this little Use Alpha button, then we're going to get the background back as well. Now obviously we don't want to mix it in like that, because we're going to lose all the lighting data and all the glossy data and basically all the data in the image. So what we need to do is change this to multiply instead. Now this will keep all the lighting data, but the problem is it will also keep, if we have a look, the reflection data. So you can see we've got a reflection here of this monkey's ear over here, and this is unrealistic. You wouldn't have a glossy reflection on top of dirt. So we would need to somehow fix that, and that's where we're going to move on to the more advanced usage very shortly. But firstly, I just want to show you how you can limit the effect to individual objects, and also how you can change it so that the dirt doesn't appear on the entire model, just in the nooks and crannies. And to do this, we're going to need some additional data. So we're going to need to turn on a few more passes. We're going to need, firstly, the ambient occlusion. So this will allow us to get the nooks and crannies. And then we need to also be able to select individual objects. And for that, we're going to use the object cryptomat. Very importantly, when enabling a data pass such as the cryptomat, you need to make sure that you always save the OpenEXR multilayer that you're outputting these passes to. So if I change this to OpenEXR multilayer, you need to also always make sure that this is set to full float. So this is 32-bit and this is 16-bit. If you choose to save out as 16-bit, then parts of the data will be missing and you won't be able to use the cryptomat correctly. Now, if you're using turbo tools, you also need to do the same thing. Go into preferences, into the add-on preferences, and just make sure that the render layer cache bit depth is set to 32-bit. This is the same as the full float over here. And obviously, if you are using turbo tools, you wouldn't output to OpenEXR multilayer in Blender settings. You'd always set this to something like, such as FFmpeg. Otherwise, you're going to be generating two multilayer EXRs, and that will take up additional disk space unnecessarily. So let's quickly re-render now that we've re-enabled these passes. So F12. Alright, and once that's finished rendering, you'll see that we've got these new sockets now. So if we click on this one, Control Shift click on that, you'll see we've got the white areas and the black areas. The black areas indicate the nooks and crannies, so we can use that data to limit the dirt to only the nooks and crannies. So the first thing then, let's go back to this one. We'll move this out of the way a little bit. And I want to use the ambient occlusion as the factor for this multiplication. So plug that in there, and that's limited the dirt to the white parts of that ambient occlusion pass. And of course, we need it to be on the black parts. So all we'll do is drop a ramp node between the ambient occlusion output and the factor input, and then swap over the white and black so that it inverts the mask. And then we can control the strength of the dirt by sliding the white slider to the right. So let's move on to limiting which objects get this effect. And that's where we can use the cryptomat that we've just saved. Just tidy it up a little bit. So the cryptomat we can use in a number of ways. We've got two nodes. We've got the legacy cryptomat and the cryptomat, the new one. Basically, we can use either. I'll go with the new one because we don't have to mess about plugging anything into it. We need to tell the cryptomat node where to get the cryptomat data from. So if you've just rendered, you can leave this on render and it will get the cryptomat data that's stored in the render layers node. If your cryptomat data is stored in an image, as it is here for me because I'm using turbo tools, then you need to change this to image and then select the image and specify the cryptomat layer. It's always going to be the lowest one, so in this case number 4. And then you can generate a mask by hovering over the plus icon, pressing E on the keyboard, and then just clicking the area of the screen where the object is. And you'll notice as I move this eyedropper over the image, we get a little tooltip telling us what it is that we're hovered over. Now you would normally do it with the pick enabled, so you can plug this one into a viewer node and you can very easily see which one you're selecting without needing to refer to the tooltips. Right, so we've created a few masks, we've clicked on a few objects and it's created this mask for us. What we need to do now is use this mask to mix between the dirty ones and the original ones. So let's just copy this image across, or the render layers node in your case, if you're not using Turbo Tools or a pre-rendered EXR. And Shift A, S, mix, drop this in after this one. And we need to plug the matte of the cryptomatte into the factor. So any white areas on this mask now are going to be given the bottom material, and any black areas on the mask will get the dirty monkeys that are plugged into the top socket of the mix node. So we'll connect the original image to the bottom socket of the mix node, so we get the original monkeys instead of that flat white colour. And if you want to remove some of those monkeys from the mask, you just click on the minus sign and then click on the object in the viewport. And you can add them back in by clicking on the plus and then adding them back to the mask. You can either, if you decide you don't want to have any clean monkeys in there, you want them all to be dirty, you can either delete the cryptomatte node, or you can just delete all the text in the matte ID text box, or you can mute the mix node. Alright, so just to recap how it works, we've taken a 2D texture and we've used the UV pass to wrap this texture onto the 3D model, and we've then limited the dirt to the nooks and crannies of the 3D objects using the ambient occlusion pass. We've then used a cryptomatte to choose between the clean and the dirty monkeys. Alright, so let's move on to more advanced usage, which will allow us to get rid of these glossy reflections in the dirty areas, but will also allow us to add new textures, bump maps, and shadows to the individual objects or to entire materials throughout the scene. Before we go any further, we do need to understand one of the fundamentals of 3D, and that's that the main image pass, so this one here, is actually made up of individual images. So the Cycles render engine will render diffuse information, glossy information, transmissive information, volume, emission and environment, and then it will use these individual images and combine them in a way that rebuilds this image. Now, currently, we don't have these passes enabled, so we don't have access to them. So let's turn these on. We'll go all the way down to environment and we'll re-render. And also, by the way, I'm going to turn on, if you're using Turbo Tools, what we can do is enable Turbo Render and set it to use the ultra denoising mode, and that will make sure that all of those individual passes are denoised. Otherwise, we might have to add a denoise node in the compositor to each output, and that will be quite slow. I'll set this to use user, so it uses the same samples I was using before, and we only want to denoise the diffuse and the glossy because there's no other information in the scene. Alright, so F12, and while that's rendering, let's have a quick look at the documentation in the Blender website. So you can see to recreate the combined image, we need to add together the direct and indirect passes of each ray type, so the diffuse, glossy, transmission, and then we've also got emission and environment. We need to multiply the result of each of those with the color pass of each element as well. So you add together diffuse direct and diffuse indirect, and then you multiply the result of this with a diffuse color, and you do the same all the way through. It's really quick to set up, so let's go back to Blender, and we can see we've now got these additional passes to work with. So let's add these together in the same manner as described here. Just to make it easier to see what I'm doing, let's copy this across. And we'll have a quick look at the passes first to understand what they do. So we've got the diffuse direct, this is direct lighting. Diffuse indirect, this is the lighting that's bounced. We've got the diffuse color, so this is the color that was plugged into the base slot of the BSDF shader. If we remember, if we go over here, the base color is grey, so it's going to show as grey in the diffuse color. If there was a texture plugged into the base color, then we would see the texture in here. We've got the gloss direct, indirect, gloss color, no transmission, no volume in the scene, no emission, but we have got an environment. Alright, so let's start doing it. Shift A, S, mix, make this one add, copy it, Shift D, change it to multiply. And we're going to add together the diffuse direct and the diffuse indirect. We're going to multiply the result of these with a diffuse colour. So we can minimise these by pressing H to give us a bit more space. I want to copy these, and I want to do the same for the gloss direct, add these with the gloss indirect, multiply with the colour. Same again for the transmission. So transmission direct, transmission indirect are added together, multiply with the colour. Volume, we don't have a colour, so we just add those ones together. So volume direct, added to the volume indirect, and this will give us all of the passes. So we've got the diffuse, glossy, transmission, and volume. We need to now add these together, as we can see here. Once we've combined each element, we then add them together to create the combined image. So let's copy this add node and just add all the completed ones together. So this one is adding the diffuse and the glossy, and now we want to add this one to the transmission, and then we also want to add in the volume. We want to also add the emission, and finally we want to add in the environment. So let's see what's happening. We've got the glossy and diffuse added together. We've added the transmission, but there isn't any, so because it's black, basically, that means it's 0, and when you add 0 to something, it makes no difference. Same again for the volume, emission, and then we do have an environment. So when the environment gets added in, let's just have a quick check of this. You can see the areas that aren't black will be added to the image. And that gives us the complete image, which matches up with what we had before. The difference is now, we can actually manipulate the individual passes to give us a lot more control over what we can do with the end result. So let's just create a bit more space. S, Y, scale on the Y-axis. And I'll quickly label these as well. So I'll select these two and press Shift P to create a frame around them. They're going to be the diffuse, glossy, transmission, and the volume. And if you don't like all these wires going all over the place, I know I don't, you can just copy this one over here and we'll plug in the emission from this one instead. And we'll do the same with the environment in here, just so we don't have those wires crossing over each other. And by the way, if you click on a node, you can press Ctrl H to hide the sockets that aren't in use, and that will make it even neater as well. We'll do the same on this one for now. All right. So let's start rebuilding the dirt map first. We'll bring across these nodes here. So Shift D, bring those over. We'll get rid of them over here. We don't need this multiply anymore. All we need to do is plug the result of this image here into the one that gets mixed with the cryptomat. So this is going to be the dirty one, and this will still be the clean one. All right. First thing then, we need to add this texture, so this one, into the diffuse color. So Shift A, S, mix, drop that in there. I'm going to plug this into the bottom. Let's have a look at the result. You can see now the entire monkey has now been mixed, has now got this material because this is set to 1. If I change this mix factor to 0, we're back to the original grey. I do need to point out that unlike other render engines, Cycles will include texture data into the diffuse lighting passes, so the diffuse direct and diffuse indirect. This is so Cycles can render faster, apparently. It's quite unfortunate because it means if you do have a texture already in the base color of an object, then you aren't going to be able to fully replace the texture in post. You're always going to get the old texture just shining through a little bit because of that texture data being included in the lighting data passes instead of being restricted just to the color pass where ideally it should be. So it's always going to work best if you do this technique on an object or a material that has no texture into the base color. So we need to control this with the ambient occlusion, same as last time. So let's grab this ambient occlusion output, plug this into the factor. And now we've got the dirt again just in those nooks and crannies. Let's have a look at what it looks like when it's combined with the glossy. So the same problem as before, the glossiness is still on those dirty areas. And in order to remove that, all we need to do is make the dirty areas black on this glossy colour. Because don't forget, this is what's used to control which parts of the object are going to be glossy and which aren't. So we need to add a mix node. I'm going to set this one to multiply. We'll bring this ambient occlusion down here a bit. Plug this into here. And this is going to change the glossy colour from here, like this, to now be like this. The problem is the white areas of the map are in the nooks and crannies, so that means that they're the areas that are going to be glossy. As we can see here, the gloss is now only on the dirty areas, which is incorrect. So all we need to do basically is invert the ambient occlusion that's leading to that multiply node. Shift A, S, invert, and drop that between the colour ramp and the input here. And now it's the other way around. If I just mute this invert, you can see there's the difference. Alright, let's look at the result of that. And now we're back to having the gloss only in the non-dirty areas and no gloss where it's dirty, which is exactly what we wanted and what we couldn't achieve before without using the individual passes. So let's reconnect the end node and then we'll just tidy up the node tree a little bit and add a few labels. And now we can use what we've learned to replace a full material with the texture and a bump map and even the shadows after we've rendered. And we only want to do it for specific materials rather than specific objects. I mean, we could do it for specific objects, but it makes more sense if your clients asked you to change the material or the texture of a certain material, then we need to do it on a material basis. And for that, we need to enable a different pass. This time, it's going to be the Cryptomat material. Let's go to the layout workspace and we'll give one of these monkeys a different material. So let's click this one, click on the duplicate button. So we've got a new material and we'll just make this one red. All right. Go back to the compositor and we'll do another render. So F12. And we've got an interesting error message, and I'm glad this has popped up because if people are using Turbo Tools, you might see this. All it means is that a node that's being cached is now missing. So we've got the cache node still, but the node that it's replaced is no longer in the scene, so it can't unwire it in order for the render to start. So if we zoom in on this map UV node, we can check what it's called now. It's map UV 001, and that's because if you remember earlier, we copied this across by duplicating the original one. So in order to fix this, just rename this to map UV. And now if we render, it will start. And now that's finished rendering, you can see that we've got a red monkey over here, and then we've got the other objects here. And just to see what's happening there, let's drop in another Cryptomat material, Cryptomat node. And I want this to be using this image, or you can use whatever's necessary for your scene. So I'm going to use the image. And we've got this cache node here. I want to choose the, let's just check, crypto material, and it's in alphabetical order. So we want L. And if we look at the picker, you can see we've got 3, which are the same material, and this one, which is the red one. And quite annoyingly, after you've rendered, Blender, for some reason, will unhide everything that you've hidden. So just select all these again. And just do Ctrl H. And then we're back to where we were. So I want to change these 3 monkeys only to have, instead of a grey material, a pebble material. But I want that pebble material to have a bump as well and some new shadows. So let me find a pebble texture on my computer. I'm going to bring this one in. So that's the image. And I'm also going to bring in the normals. Same as before, I want to map these onto the 3D objects. So I need to use a map UV node. So I'm going to Control Shift D on this one to keep the connections. And I'll do Alt P to unparent it from the frame. And instead of this colour, I want to use this one. And if we have a look at what that's done, it's added the pebble material to all of those objects. Now we don't want it on all of the objects, we only want it on these three here, which is where the Cryptomatte is going to come in. And don't forget, I need to mix this in to the diffuse colour before we add the dirt. So I'm going to copy this one, Shift D. And I want to grab this, plug it into the bottom. And I want to control it with this new Cryptomatte over here. So use the factor from this Cryptomatte for this one. And at the moment, this mask is empty. If we just have a look, there's nothing on it yet. And all I do is hover over the plus symbol, E, on here, and I'll choose the material that I want. And you'll notice this time, it doesn't give us a different tooltip for each monkey, because each of these monkeys now uses the same material. It will give us a different tooltip if we hover over this one, because this monkey uses material 002. So let's click on this one. And now we've got the pebbles added just to this material here. Now this is getting quite slow, so I'm going to click on this map UV node, and I'm going to use Turbo Tools to cache it, and it'll calculate one more time, and then it'll be cached, and I won't have to keep calculating it, and the user interface will become very fast again. Alright, annoyingly, because we've re-rendered basically, I'm going to do Control H again. Alright. Next thing, I want to add a bump map to these pebbles. So we'll take this one. I'm going to copy this, Control Shift D to keep the links. Change the pebbles texture for this normals texture. And if we look at this one now, you can see we've got the normals wrapped around the 3D objects. And I'm going to cache it just to make it faster. So what can we do with this normal map? Now we've got it mapped onto these monkeys. Well, we can actually use a normal node. If we drop this in here, and we need to look at the dot, not the normal. If we rotate this around, you'll see we can actually start adding shadows into the scene based on the normals that we've just put onto those objects. So we need to now mix this lighting information, the shadow information that we've created using the normals, into the lighting information of the render. And don't forget, this is in the diffuse, indirect and direct that have been added together before being multiplied with the colour. So very simply, what we're going to do, Shift A, S, and then mix. Drop this in here, and I want to plug the dot in here. So this is before, this is after, and I want to multiply it. Let's just move this around. I want it to be predominantly white, with the dark areas limited to the cracks between the pebbles. There we go. And if we look at the result, we've now got the bump map applied onto the pebbles. And again, we don't want it to affect this one over here. So very simply, same as before, we're going to take the Cryptomatte we've got over here and just plug this into the factor. And now the pebble shadow is limited to the monkeys with this material on the left. And I don't want the pebble shadows to be in the areas where we've got dirt. So to make sure that doesn't happen, we just need to modify the mask from the Cryptomatte that's controlling where those shadows appear. Shift A, S, and do a mix. Drop this in here, change it to multiply, and then multiply this with the ambient occlusion. Invert it. And now the shadows are restricted to the pebbled area. And because the one ambient occlusion node is controlling virtually everything that we've added, we can make any adjustments we want just by sliding these around to get the look that we're after. So it gives you a lot of control. And if you wanted to, you could add the normals for the dirt as well and add shadow for that. But I don't want this tutorial to go on for too long. Hopefully you've got the idea. So if you need to do that, you can. And last thing, let's just turn back on the full image. And there we go. And now that we've modified a single frame, all the changes that we've made in the tree will be applied to every single frame of the animation. And if you want to re-render it, all you do is click on Publish Animation if you're using Turbo Tools, and that will output it to whatever you've got set up in the output section, Blender's output section here, something like an FFmpeg for example. Or, if you're not using Turbo Tools, then you must be using a multi-layer EXR that you've already saved out, and in that case, all you do is make sure you don't have a render layers node in the scene, so we delete this, and then when you render an animation as normal with Ctrl F12, it will output the multi-layer EXR image sequence with these modifications made to whatever you've set again in Blender's output section. So hopefully this tutorial has been useful, and don't forget, if you want to support the channel, get much faster renders and get access to the caching system I showed you in this tutorial, then visit 3d-illusions.co.uk where you can get Turbo Tools. And for those of you that are already members at 3d-illusions.co.uk, you'll find this completed scene file waiting for you in the download section of the membership area. Hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one.